What's up, everybody? We're going to make a 36 inch by 36 inch bookcase. This one's out of solid walnut. It's actually for my hardest client yet, my wife. So start off, I cut these about 38 inches to start with, and that's just to leave me a little bit of material on each side. Square them up, as well as if anything goes wrong, I have a little extra material to work with. It's almost always a good idea when you're rough cutting to leave a little length. You notice I did try to cut the knot out here, so you avoid some of the waste on the material later, or a risk of cutting it too short by leaving it a little bit long if you miss something like this. I'm just using the miter saw, cutting one side square. This is S3S lumber, so it's already got three sides already surfaced. So you see here, I'm just using the table saw to surface that fourth side. And with the exception of the opposite end that I did not cut with the miter saw, you're going to have a square board. And you'll see me squaring that other side up in just a second. Right here, I was just using a square, marking it, and I'll move it to the miter saw to get that fourth side square. The beauty of using this S3S lumber is you don't have to have a jointer or a planer to get your boards square to be used. And you can get by without a jointer anyway, but this is just to take some steps out, and if you don't have all the proper tools, it definitely makes it easier. When you're cutting hardwood, you want to take your time when you're cutting through it to avoid blowout. Here I'm just going through all the different boards. I'm trying to decide which ones I want on the outsides. This is kind of the part where you pick out the best looking boards, decide where you want them, to decide which side you want up, generally just to decide your layout. Here I don't have stop blocks on my miter saw, so I'm just using a pretty nifty trick. Just use double-sided tape, tape the two boards together, then I'll take them to the miter saw, cut just square cuts on both ends of the board. That's going to give you two parallel boards. This is important because these are going to be your leg boards, the outside of the bookshelf. If these boards aren't identical, you could have a little bit of wobble on the floor, and unless you want to level the floor, then make sure your boards are cut identical. Plus, this particular build was for my hardest client ever, my wife, and she'd get pretty upset if it had a wobble in it, so we took our time here, made sure everything was going to line up. She also told me I couldn't level the floor, so here we are. And I'm just going to take a small portion off both sides. Here I'm going to go ahead and cut those legs to their final length, so you go ahead and see me measure them. I'll square them off with a square, and I'm just going to cut them with that miter saw. You absolutely could use a crosscut sled here, but for purposes of this, the miter saw is perfectly accurate enough, and I wasn't too concerned about needing it to be any more accurate than what my miter saw could do. If you're enjoying the video or getting anything out of it, I would greatly appreciate if you'd like and subscribe. It helps me out quite a bit, and it allows me to continue to make videos like this. Alright, when you're cutting to final size, it's very important that you make sure the kerf of your blade is considered. So when I marked it, the measurement I wanted, I make sure to cut on the side of the line that I'm discarding. That way that 1/16 of an inch kerf on my blade is not cutting into the actual length of my shelves. So pro tip, I'm going to cut dados in this, and I don't want to have to measure down and mark to cut my dados, so I'm just going to go ahead and stack all my boards up the way that I'm going to have them, and I'm going to clamp them together so I can mark out the board where the dados go instead of having to rely on measurements. I don't know about your measuring skills, but if I was to try to measure all this, I can almost guarantee you something would go wrong, and with the cost of hardwoods these days, that's not something I'm interested in having. So take the minute, get everything lined up, get it in clamps, mark it, and then move it over to the dado. So what you see me doing here is just making templates that I'm going to put in between the shelves. Couple of reasons. The most important reason is so my measurements is exactly the same on each shelf, but also it's going to help hold those shelves in place since they're not actually going to be glued or dadoed while I'm marking them. This is just plywood. Like I said, it's just a template, so it doesn't matter what you make it out of here. I want my shelves 11 inches apart, so that's what you're going to see me measuring here. And I'm just confirming my measurements because I want this one to be exact. I did move this over to the crosscut sled. It's a little shorter and easier to deal with. And like I said, I want this exact, so I used the crosscut sled. Alright, you'll just using those templates to get my spacing between shelves, and I cut some more off camera for each shelf. 2 for each, 1 for each end. And I'm just going to clamp them up and then I'll mark them. I used a marking knife to mark them instead of a pencil. You can use a pencil if you don't have a marking knife. I just like the thin curve of that marking knife, as well as it gives me an actual groove to look at versus just a pencil mark. And on walnut, the pencil mark can be kind of hard to see. Alright, here's the sketchy part. I'm getting ready to run a dado blade, so a wider blade through the walnut. And if it's wrong, there ain't a whole lot of ways of fixing it. So make sure your marks is right. Take your time before you actually run it through that table saw. And for those that are not familiar, a dado stack is just 2 blades with some chippers in between, and it just allows you to cut these wide gaps with a single pass on the table saw. There's multiple ways of cutting dados, but this is just the one that I chose for this particular project. If you don't have a dado stack, you could use a ravening blade on a router, or you could just use a regular table saw and cut the 2 sides and then just make multiple passes to cut out the material in between. So ever how you want to do it, there's multiple ways of doing it, but just choose one and make it work. Here I'm just doing a dry fit. Just want to make sure everything looks good before I actually get to the glue up. And everything turned out quite well on this one. I did almost cut the bottom one incorrectly, but I noticed it, fixed it before I run it through the dado stack. Just clarity there. So here I'm just taking an 1/8 inch round over bit, and I'm just going to run over all the corners of the board except the ones that's in the actual dados. I don't like to do it on the dados because I want those to fit pretty tight, and I cut them just loose enough that there'll be plenty of room for glue, so I'm not worried about having to round them over for glue. I believe this bit's from probably Bits and Bits. That's where most of my bits come from these days, but I'll link them all in the description for you. No, actually that's a Whiteside bit, I'm sorry. Alright, this can make a huge difference in your projects. So I'm just taking a marking knife. You can use anything like dental pick, something like that, to remove any of the loose materials that's in the knots or anywhere on your boards. Make sure you get those out, and then we're going to fill the holes, because at the end of the project we want to make sure we have a perfectly smooth board. And these little knots can come out later on, and it just looks way more professional if you seal them. We're just using medium thickness brown CA glue. It's essentially just super glue. This color and thickness works really good on walnut, and I basically only use medium thickness. And that's just the activator. It just speeds up the process of the glue hardening. I think I've made a video about this before, but we're just taking a pencil, running it down everywhere we're going to sand. That just makes sure that everything's good and even. It's pretty easy to get uneven on a board this large. And you can see this side had a pretty large crack in it, so I used quite a bit of CA glue down that crack to seal it in. You could also use something like a bow tie. Bow tie could look really good here, but my client didn't want that in this particular project. And the last thing I would want is the board to crack with time, so fill it up with CA glue. Sanding's probably the most boring thing you can possibly watch, so I sanded all the boards. I give you about 30 seconds there. But just understand, if you're doing this at home, that you got to sand everything. And I started with 90 grit, and I worked my way all the way up to 220. You may want to stop at 120 if you're using the same finish that I'm going to use. We'll talk about that later, but I'm putting a clear coat on top of that, and that's the reason I'm able to do that. So here I'm just making sure I get plenty of glue in my dados. Going to glue everything up, put it in clamps, and that's what the bookshelf is going to look like. Alright, here, so I'm using Rubio Monocoat. Now it says that it's literally called monocoat, which means one coat, and they say that you can't put a second coat on it, that it's so good that it won't absorb the second coat. And while they're not wrong, what you'll see me do later on is scuff the finish up to put a second coat on it. Now you absolutely don't have to do that step. However, the first coat's pretty dull, but if you take this non-woven pad, I use the maroon color. The different colors are different, essentially grits if you were talking sandpaper, but you see it gets a haze over it. And all I'm doing, like I said, is scuffing that finish up so I can put that second coat on, and it just gives it a much higher gloss. And I was looking for more of a satin look than that matte finish, so I'm going to put that second coat on. Also, if you're using Rubio, they say not to go above 120 grit to ensure that it has a good bond. But all it's going to do is reduce the protection just a little bit. So I'm going to put a clear coat on top of this. So it's not going to matter that I sanded it down to 220. So essentially I'm just going to get a little bit more gloss. The first coat, you see me just putting it on with just like a starch rag. And this time I'm using a buffer. Well, I'm actually using a buffer or a sander with a buffer pad on it. But either way, you don't have to have a buffer to put this second coat on either. It's a little easier than doing it by hand. And you can see how much shine that got already. And this is after the clear coat. And I'll link that clear coat in the description. It's a little bit expensive. It's sold by Blacktail Studios, but he does a lot of tests on it, and it's well worth putting it on a project like this that's pretty high traffic. This client's got small kids, so I wanted to add as much protection as possible. And you can see that walnut turned out gorgeous. Alright, well, I appreciate the watch. I hope you got something out of it, and if you did, please like and subscribe to the video.